Kadal is suffocating. The once unassailable desert fortress is trapped inside a flawless, absolute vice. For years, the civilian population relied on the empty promises of protection whispered by the FLN extremists, only to find themselves blockaded, abandoned, and starved under a punishing 50-degree Saharan sun. This is the turning point. The Malian armed forces, operating in perfect unison with the Russian African Corps, have completely sealed the strategic perimeter, severing the vital lifeline from Algeria and flatly refusing any foreign pressure to negotiate. The illusion of external control is shattering in real time. If power changes hands but the underlying structure remains untouched, has anything truly changed? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates with your spirit, show your support with a comment or a subscription. It means more than mere numbers. It keeps the flame of truth alive. Welcome to the Upright Chronicles. To our global family, and particularly the proud members of the African Diaspora watching across the United States, who have long witnessed the systematic exploitation of the continent. What we are witnessing today in the year 2026 is a fundamental realignment of global power. The legendary Battle of Kidal is no longer a localized conflict. It is a profound declaration of absolute autonomy. For decades, the mainstream Western media painted a picture of perpetual African helplessness, keeping the geopolitical truth hidden behind a clever mask of humanitarian concern. But beneath the shifting sands of West Africa, a deeper, unyielding reality is breaking through. We are tracking a historic reclamation of sovereignty, dignity, and generational survival. To understand the tectonic shift occurring in West Africa today, one must look at the map of Mali, far away from the capital of Bamako, deep into the northern wastes where lies the isolated city of Kidal. It is a landscape defined by jagged rock, sweeping sands, and an atmosphere so dry it burns the throat on first breath. In this hyper-arid wilderness, temperature is not merely a feature of nature, it is a brutal weapon. When the thermometer climbs past 50 degrees Celsius, survival becomes a desperate hourly calculation. For generations, this remote stronghold was deemed an impenetrable sanctuary where insurgent forces could easily fade into the rocky crags and mock the sovereign authority of the state. But in the year 2026, that ancient illusion has been completely scorched away. The insurgent coalition, primarily the Front de Libération de l'Azawad, found themselves trapped within a cage of their own making. They entered the central city with triumphant declarations promising the local civilians absolute protection and guaranteeing that the situation was firmly under control. Yet those promises evaporated as quickly as morning dew on a desert stone. What these fighters failed to comprehend is that modern warfare is dictated not by raw bravado, but by the cold, unyielding mathematics of logistics. This brings us to what military analysts call the most short-sighted strategic blunder of the 21st century. The insurgent high command marched hundreds of their fighters into the heart of Kidal, locking themselves behind its urban perimeter without securing their rear or establishing an escape route. To occupy a desert city without controlling its access points is an act of voluntary imprisonment. Look at the geometry of this campaign. To the north of Kadal lies Tessalit, the primary artery through which all heavy supplies, fuel, and ammunition flow across the border from Algeria. Sitting directly between Tessalit and central Kadal is a crucial bottleneck known as Aguelhok. By failing to capture and hold Aguelhok, the insurgent leadership left their entire northern flank wide open to disaster. The regular armed forces of Mali, alongside the highly coordinated units of the Russian African Corps, spotted this glaring vulnerability instantly. They did not rush into a bloody, unpredictable urban street fight. Instead, they acted with methodical patience, establishing an impenetrable screen around Aguelhok. Using advanced reconnaissance and high-altitude surveillance to track every single movement on the desert floor, the state forces cut the region into isolated pockets. Every single truck and motorized convoy attempting to travel from Tessalit to Kadal was spotted, intercepted, and dismantled before it could come within sight of the city gates. The northern supply line was completely severed, rendered done and dusted on sight. In the desert, ammunition is entirely secondary to water. Without bullets, a soldier can defend a wall for a day. Without water, he cannot even lift his rifle. Reports from deep within the blockaded city indicate that the infrastructure is rapidly fracturing. the vital water towers, the absolute lifeblood of the urban center, have been severely compromised by the ongoing operations, while official verification remains difficult due to the thick fog of war. The reality speaks clearly through the immediate actions of the population. The local civilians, realizing that the insurgent forces could no longer provide even the most basic elements of human survival, began a massive, sorrowful exodus. Families packed what little possessions they could carry, turning away from the false promises of the militants, and fled towards Timbuktu and southwards. The streets of Kadal emptied, leaving only the hardened core of the extremist fighters to confront the gathering storm. They had sought a grand seat of power, but they had instead inherited a tomb of dust. As the physical walls closed in, the psychological bonds holding the militant alliance together began to snap under the immense pressure. A bitter, venomous internal conflict erupted between the major factions on the ground. The terrorist coalition known as Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin split completely down its ideological fault line. The faction loyal to Iyad Ghali found itself at violent loggerheads, with the forces commanded by Amadou Kufa. This was a desperate, bloody struggle for survival as internal resources dwindled to nothing. The Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin alliance had already suffered the highest level of casualties in the preliminary skirmishes, and the auxiliary fighters who had arrived from Chad were completely decimated by the state advance. To sustain such horrific losses while watching the water reserves vanish created a pressure cooker of intense paranoia inside the city. Left with no external options, the remaining fighters turned to raw desperation, looting the local markets and stripping the civilian bazaars of any remaining grain or fuel. They had run out of plans. There was no plan B, no plan C, and certainly no plan D. Meanwhile, the regular Malian forces and the Russian African Corps did not rush their advance. Operating from their forward bases in Anefis, just a short distance away, they began a gradual tightening ground movement towards central Kadal. The progress was deliberately slow, calculated to minimize friendly casualties, because the retreating insurgents had littered the sandy approaches with hundreds of improvised explosive devices. Specialized engineering teams moved foot by foot, discovering and detonating these hidden traps with mechanical precision. Above them, the skies belonged entirely to the state. The constant low-grade hum of reconnaissance aircraft served as a psychological torment to the men below, a reminder that their movements were completely visible to their adversary. The militants could no longer hide because the modern state had illuminated the desert, exposing their positions to a brand new type of warfare. Yet as the ground forces crept closer and the internal fractures deepened, an even greater terror was about to descend from above, transforming the siege into an unprecedented display of fire and steel. The dry desert air did not merely carry dust, it carried the terrifying thunder of an unprecedented aerial onslaught. What occurred in the skies over Kidal was not a standard military engagement. It was a systematic, merciless demonstration of modern air power that transformed the fortress city into a crucible of fire. State-of-the-art unmanned aerial vehicles supplied to the Malian government to safeguard its domestic integrity rewrote the rules of the Kidal Military Campaign in a single afternoon. The scale of devastation was catastrophic for the entrenched militants. Entire defensive lines, fortified command posts, and hidden bunkers that had resisted conventional artillery for months were completely flattened. The blast radius of these strikes was so immense that it altered the physical topology of the suburbs, leaving vast craters where complex insurgent networks once stood. Inside this inferno, the insurgent fighters of the Front de Libération de l'Azawad scrambled through the debris not to counterattack, but to salvage their fading narrative. Realizing that their physical grip on the city was slipping away, they turned to a psychological weapon as old as asymmetric warfare itself: the manipulation of international sympathy. Specialized intelligence units from the Sahel Alliance forces uncovered a bizarre and cynical performance on the ground. The militants began loading ordinary farm animals, specifically donkeys, into the back of heavily armed supply trucks. When one of these trucks was accurately struck by a precision missile on the outer eastern flank of Kadal, the immediate aftermath revealed the depth of their deception. As the smoke cleared, cameras captured donkeys wandering aimlessly around the wreckage, but scattered across the burning tarmac alongside the animals were hundreds of automatic rifles, crates of ammunition, and heavy rocket launchers. The insurgents had deliberately attempted to construct a macabre stage play. They hoped that by exposing dead or injured livestock to the world, they could accuse the Malian state of violating international humanitarian law and targeting innocent agricultural convoys. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be thank you or God bless the nations fighting for their destiny. Why? Because each thank you carries weight. Each thank you says, I hear this, I feel this, I stand with this. Imagine hundreds of people adding their thanks. It turns a video into a movement of solidarity. So write your thank you now and let your voice be part of this shared journey. This desperate theatricality did nothing to slow the relentless advance. As the physical encirclement tightened, the panic inside Kidal reverberated all the way to the glass towers of the United Nations in New York and the political salons of Paris. Realizing that their proxies were facing total annihilation, Western powers and various human rights organizations scrambled to broker a sudden diplomatic lifeline. They approached the sovereign government of Mali with a formal proposal, suggesting a conditional humanitarian passage. The terms were simple. The insurgent forces would voluntarily relinquish their hold on Kadal and evacuate the city entirely, provided they were granted safe conduct out of the war zone without facing prosecution or military pursuit. It was a classic geopolitical maneuver designed to preserve an asset for a future conflict. The response from Bamako was immediate, shocking the diplomatic corps with its uncompromising clarity. On the 14th of November, the Malian Foreign Minister, Abdoulaye Diop, issued a definitive public statement that reverberated across the international community. He flatly rejected any possibility of a compromise, stating clearly that the era of backroom deals with armed extremists was over. Foreign Minister Abdoulaye Diop declared, "There will be no negotiation and no humanitarian escape for those who have terrorized our citizens and compromised our statehood." This was a breathtaking departure from the weak yielding policies of previous puppet administrations. For decades, foreign entities had used international bodies to force African states into endless, paralyzing dialogues that only served to entrench instability. Not this time. This is not law. This is not justice. This is enforcement. The psychological impact of this diplomatic wall on the remaining fighters inside Kidal was devastating. They suddenly realized that the old rules no longer applied. The structural protection they once enjoyed from external patrons had vanished. The Malian state was no longer playing a game of containment. It was executing a strategy of total eradication. The international community could no longer save them, and the local population had already abandoned them. They were entirely alone in a ruined city with empty canteens and dwindling magazines. The media landscape exploded with conflicting narratives. Western broadcasters wept over the collapse of the decades-old security architecture in the Sahel, warning of an impending catastrophe, while local radio stations across Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou celebrated the unyielding posture of their leadership. The masses understood what the elite refused to admit, that true peace cannot be bought with concessions to terror. Yet, as the gongs of total defeat sounded over the insurgent lines, an even darker reality began to emerge from the shadows of history, showing that the battle for Kidal was merely the surface of a much deeper war for the very soul and wealth of the continent. The physical echoes of the artillery may slowly fade into the desert wind, but the domestic security and political order of the region have been permanently altered. The immediate fallout of the Kidal Military Campaign extends far beyond the blood-stained sand dunes. It has sent massive shockwaves through the entire domestic landscape of Mali. In the short term, the economic realities are incredibly stark and unforgiving. Markets that once bustled with cross-border trade between Bamako and the northern territories now stand quiet, choked by the necessary but severe security restrictions implemented by the state to flush out hidden networks. For the ordinary citizens living along these volatile corridors, daily survival requires immense resilience. Desperate remnants of the terrorist groups routinely attempt to block civilian convoys attempting to paralyze local trade and cut off the southern supply of grain. Yet, despite the immense economic friction and the temporary paralysis of local infrastructure, a profound psychological transformation is taking root among the population. The people are no longer trapped in the paralyzing fear that defined the previous decades of foreign-managed chaos. To truly understand why the civilian population continues to support the transitional government, despite these severe daily hardships, one must look closely at the deep structural wounds inflicted by decades of neocolonial neglect. Consider the profound, sickening contrast that defines the daily life of these rural communities. Mali stands proudly as one of the top producers of gold in the entire West African region, a land blessed with vast, glittering subterranean wealth that should ensure top-tier prosperity. Yet when you look at the conditions under which the local population has been forced to exist, the reality is deeply shocking to the marrow. Video footage captured from the rural north reveals a harrowing human landscape. Dwellings made of rusted scrap metal and torn fabric sit directly atop some of the richest mineral soil on the planet. Recently, when armed rebel factions ruthlessly targeted a group of innocent civilians on the outskirts of these mining communities, it was not the well-funded international aid agencies that rushed to provide comfort. It was the mobile medical units of the Russian African Corps that provided emergency treatment, binding wounds and saving lives in the dirt. A prominent French journalist recently noted with astonishment that when you travel north of the capital, you find vast markets selling nothing but onions, no meat, no chicken, just rows of onions under the burning sun. How can a nation built on gold be reduced to an economy of onions? Pause for a moment and share with us in the comment section below where you are watching this video from. Is it from Africa, Europe, or the Americas? The Upright Chronicles would like to express our deepest gratitude to everyone for walking with us on this journey. We send a heartfelt wish across the distance. May freedom and dignity walk beside you and your family wherever you are on this earth. The answer to this tragic riddle does not lie in a lack of natural resources, but in the calculated betrayal of the native political class. For generations, the politicians in the capital cities of West Africa did not serve their constituents. They functioned merely as the secondary mediocre associates of foreign imperialists. The ordinary citizens were entirely removed from the economic equation, viewed by their own westernized leaders as nothing better than slaves. While ordinary families' starvations, the children and cousins of these corrupt officials enjoyed lives of unimaginable luxury. Look across the Atlantic Ocean at Nigeria, where the sons and daughters of politicians like Bola Tinubu purchase multi-million-dollar mansions across the United States, completely insulated from the horrific insecurity and economic ruin plaguing their homeland. In Mali, established political dynasties such as the family of Muntaga Tall spent decades making empty, performative noise in the capital, while their country's environment was systematically destroyed without them breaking a sweat. These politicians built their fortunes on the misery of the masses, ensuring that the benefits of African wealth never trickled down to the African people. This is precisely why the ordinary citizens of Mali, regardless of the temporary economic calamities and shortages, continue to offer their unwavering allegiance to the military administration of General Assimi Goïta. They recognize him not as another distant bureaucrat or an imperial puppet, but as a leader who shares their pain and fiercely defends their dignity. A Tuareg woman recently expressed the collective sentiment of millions when she stated that the people are fully prepared to endure short-term deprivation today if it guarantees a genuine sovereign tomorrow for their children. They remember the deep humiliation of the past, a time when the Western world only acknowledged the existence of Mali, when its football stars like Kadal took the field. Beyond that, the country was a dark zone of structural exploitation, its gold stolen and its sovereignty trampled. Under the current transitional leadership, that corrupt structure is finally being dismantled. For the first time in modern history, the nation is building its own independent national gold reserves, keeping the wealth within its borders to stabilize its economic future. The old elite is losing its grip, and the local population is fiercely guarding this new beginning. But as Mali cleanses its house of internal traitors, the shockwaves of this resistance are crossing international borders, forcing the former colonial master into a state of absolute geopolitical panic. The tremors of the crumbling fortress in Kidal have breached the borders of Europe, triggering a frantic, borderline comical display of diplomatic panic within the historic halls of Paris. We are witnessing what commentators mockingly describe as the stanky leg dance of French foreign policy, President Emmanuel Macron has been seen scrambling across the globe, desperately attempting to rally support from any remaining African heads of state who are still willing to look past the decades of imperial exploitation. His recent diplomatic excursion to Kenya resulted in public embarrassment, a stark reminder that the old imperial dictates no longer carry weight on a continent that has awakened to its own potential. At the United Nations Security Council, French diplomats are working tirelessly behind closed doors, attempting to construct a legal and political blockade against Russian influence in the Sahel. Yet these frantic machinations are completely empty. They do not represent a calculated grand strategy. Rather, they are the desperate dying gasps of a colonial architecture that is losing its foundation in real time. The sheer hypocrisy of this crumbling network is laid bare when one examines the raw, indisputable data of resource extraction. Consider this staggering economic paradox. The nation of France proudly holds the fourth largest gold reserve on the entire planet, totaling more than 4,000 tons of pure bullion. Yet there is not a single active gold mine within the metropolitan borders of France itself. Meanwhile, the soil of Mali is torn open daily to enrich foreign banks while its local inhabitants are left to trade in onions. Turn your gaze to neighboring Niger. For decades, Niger supplied over 65% of the uranium required to power the vast electrical grids of France, illuminating the monuments of Paris, while the ordinary people of Niger were left completely in the dark, unable to power their own homes. Worse still, when the French corporate entities exhausted these radioactive deposits, they simply abandoned the sites, leaving toxic radioactive contaminants exposed on the bare surface of the earth. This environmental negligence caused a horrific spike in fatal cancers among local civilians. In response to this absolute disregard for human dignity, the brave population of Niger took historic action, completely canceling the decades-old mining rights of French conglomerates in 2025 and 2026. However, the most unexpected variable in this grand geopolitical shift comes from across the Atlantic Ocean. Since the return of the administration of President Donald Trump to the White House in early 2025, Washington has adopted a fiercely pragmatic transactional view of West African security. In a move that has stunned European diplomats, United States intelligence agencies silently bypassed Paris, quietly restarting the sharing of high-altitude reconnaissance, satellite imagery, and critical intelligence with the Malian armed forces. Washington's motive is not born of altruism or charity. It is a calculated effort to sweep out extremist networks that threaten global shipping lanes, while simultaneously undermining old European monopolies to establish a brand new geopolitical balance. This sudden American involvement has sent shockwaves through international media. More importantly, it has deeply resonated with the older generation of the African diaspora living across the United States. For these observers, who have spent over 50 years studying the complex history of civil rights and global liberation, watching an African state successfully utilize major global rivalries to defend its borders is a moment of immense pride. It proves that the old days of unilateral Western dictation are gone, replaced by the rising reality of Sahel Alliance sovereignty. This is not a simple changing of the guard. It is the total disintegration of a century-old master-slave dynamic. The regional organizations like the Economic Community of West African States and the African Union, long weaponized by external patrons to impose artificial blockades, now find themselves completely irrelevant. The true power has shifted to the trenches where soldiers and citizens stand side by side, dictating their own terms to the world. The former colonial masters are realizing that they can no longer buy compliance with worthless paper currency or empty promises of development aid. The chains are breaking, the mask has been removed, and the table of global power is being forcefully reset. Yet, as the old empires retreat in absolute humiliation, a critical and dangerous question looms over the newly liberated territories. Can this hard-won military victory be translated into lasting economic freedom? Or will the internal scars of the past sabotage the dawning of this new era? The dawn breaking over the Sahel is no longer obscured by the thick dust of foreign intervention. It is illuminated by a fierce newborn clarity. The roadmap for the future is being drawn not in the diplomatic salons of Europe, but on the sovereign soil of West Africa itself. We are witnessing the birth of a historic economic and security fortress, the Alliance of Sahel States. This confederation represents a fundamental rejection of the old, artificial colonial fractures that kept sister nations divided for more than a century. By standing shoulder to shoulder, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are constructing an unyielding wall against external manipulation, proving that when the children of the soil unite, the old empires have no choice but to retreat. This collective awakening has fundamentally altered the strategic equation, converting a region once dismissed as a playground for foreign proxies into a powerhouse of regional self-determination. At the absolute vanguard of this historic transition stands a figure who has captured the imagination of millions across the global African diaspora, Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Taking the helm of the Alliance of Sahel States, Ibrahim Traore has moved far beyond the empty rhetoric of traditional politicians to implement concrete revolutionary policies. Under his decisive guidance, the alliance has formally operationalized its unified military architecture, activating a highly trained joint force of 6,000 soldiers dedicated to absolute mutual defense. No longer will a single nation be left to confront destabilization alone. When the sovereignty of Mali was threatened at Kidal, the collective security apparatus of the entire alliance swung into action with Burkinabe aerospace units and Nigerian reconnaissance assets mapping the terrain to assist their Malian brothers. Ibrahim Traore has systematically demonstrated that African security must be entirely authorized, funded, and executed by African hands. This total restructuring of regional defense is matched by an equally aggressive revolution within the domestic economy centered around the total reclamation of natural resources. For decades, the wealth of the land was systematically funneled into foreign banks, leaving local communities in absolute poverty. Today, that theft has been brought to a dead stop. Consider the symbol of the mine, once an instrument of colonial extraction. It has now been transformed into the bedrock of national independence. Under the unyielding leadership of General Assimi Goïta, Mali has completely overhauled its mining regulations, ensuring that the state retains a massive share of its subterranean treasures. In the year 2026, Mali has successfully amassed an independent national reserve of between 160 and 170 tons of pure gold bullion. This is a historic accumulation of wealth, entirely insulated from Western manipulation. The alliance is closely studying the successful economic model of Zimbabwe, where the national currency is directly backed by over 4 tons of solid gold, creating an unprecedented shield of monetary stability. The Sahel is proving that paper promises from international lenders can never replace the solid reality of physical gold. This is the psychological linchpin of the entire movement. The collective consciousness of the masses has experienced an irreversible awakening. The ordinary citizens who for generations were forced to endure the patronizing lectures of Western institutions have realized their own collective power and stepped into the light of true self-governance. They look back at the centuries of poverty and realize that their deprivation was never natural. It was carefully manufactured by a system that fed on their docility. The era of bowing to foreign masters is dead. The alliance does not seek permission to exist, nor does it look to the West for validation or assistance. The message echoing from the streets of Bamako to the villages of Burkina Faso is clear, rhythmic, and absolute: not charity, not pity, sovereignty. The path forward will undoubtedly be fraught with immense challenges, economic blockades, and desperate counteroffensives from the old colonial networks. Yet the momentum of history is entirely on the side of the liberated. The impending fall of the insurgent lines at Kidal is merely the opening salvo of a much larger global confrontation. As the final fortress of foreign-backed extremism begins to crumble into the desert sands, a profound question echoes across the ocean, challenging every listener to examine the true nature of global freedom. The dust over the ancient sands is finally settling, but the world that emerges from the crucible of this conflict is fundamentally unrecognizable. What we have witnessed throughout the sweeping narrative of the Kidal Military Campaign is far more than a brilliant tactical realignment or a sudden shift in local defense networks. It is the definitive collapse of an exploitative epic and the vibrant dawn of a continent reclaiming its rightful place on the global stage. for over a century. External empires extracted the immense wealth of West Africa, leaving fractured communities to suffer in poverty, while foreign capitals shone bright with stolen gold and plundered resources. Today, the legendary resilience of the Sahel has shattered those heavy chains once and for all. The strategic victory at Kidal stands as a shining monument to collective dignity, proving that true power belongs to those who are willing to fight for their ancestral land. If a nation has the vote, but not the voice, is it truly a democracy? The brave souls of the Sahel have answered this burning question, not with fragile diplomatic ink, but with the unyielding strength of real autonomy. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an isolated episode of history, it is a powerful reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still fully alive, waiting to be claimed by those bold enough to speak the truth. If this message has moved your heart and stirred your spirit, then subscribe to this channel. By choosing to subscribe, you are joining a global community that refuses to let the mainstream media dictate the narrative. And you are choosing to walk alongside us into the next triumphant chapter of Africa's unfolding story. As we gaze into the horizon, the magnificent legacy of the Sahel Alliance sovereignty offers an inspiring blueprint for self-determination that echoes deeply across the global African diaspora. The systematic success of the Kidal Military Campaign has sent an unmistakable message to every corner of the earth. The wealth of Africa belongs strictly to the people of Africa. The old masters can perform their desperate diplomatic dances and plot their backroom blockades, but they cannot reverse the great wheel of historical destiny. The awakening is absolute, the pride is restored, and the architecture of freedom is being forged in solid gold. Thank you for standing with us through these chapters of truth and liberation. This is the Upright Chronicles signing off with profound gratitude, wishing you and your loved ones strength on the road ahead, and reminding you to always keep the flame of dignity burning bright.